This is Leading Detection, a Sedulo podcast where fraud fighters talk tech. Welcome back to the Leading Detection podcast. And today we're joined by none other than the CEO and co-founder of SEON, Tamas Kadar. Thomas, welcome. It's great to have you on.
Thank you so much, Matt, for having me. And pleasure to spend the next 1 hour with you talking about the most interesting topics about fraud and identity.
Yeah, hopefully you'll give us some insight, some insider information as well for people to take away that maybe isn't out there in the wild. So yeah, we're going to be talking about fraud work mainly. So how AI and automation has changed that and what that means for talent as well within the sector. So let's start pretty simple. So tasks that fraud teams were doing, say 3 to 5 years ago, how's AI and how's changed that? What is fully automated now?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Honestly, a lot of things have changed, but also there are a lot of specific activities which haven't changed up until now, right? So what I see is the most important thing that these teams who are responsible to mitigate risk and fraud are working on. Essentially, the most important thing is making sure they have an algorithm in place which accurately classify transactions. Transactions could be onboarding attempts or registrations, logins, payments, deposits, withdrawals, and transactions overall, right? So this algorithm, as we look back a couple of years ago, mostly were created by specific rules managed and tailored by humans for accurate results, right? So what's happening, and if I go back even further than 3 or 4 years, machine learning was a prime use case for fraud detection. So many providers had some sort of like machine learning capabilities. You could also take models from the hyperscalers, but ultimately, if you only base your algorithm on machine learning, it can be only as good as your training model is. The training model is based on labels, previous outcomes of certain confirmed fraudulent and non-confirmed confirmed non-fraudulent event. It was like way more reactive a couple of years ago, as far as I see, which means that teams have allocated most of their resources to actually deal with the counter effect of fraud spikes whenever they actually have false negatives of fraud they didn't catch or confirmed, false positive cases. Non-fraud they have flagged and stopped. They invested most of their resources into making sure that they deal with that, spending time on the analysis of finding accounts who, weren't part of these, classified groups and finding out, hey, how can I tailor my algorithm in order to make the most accurate decisions? If I break it down to the, most important metrics, there's like sort of a pyramid there, the F1 score, which represents precision and recall metrics, which representing the confusion matrix elements, so false negatives, false positives, true negatives, and true positives. What I see that have changed is a lot of the best teams have moved also into spending more and more efforts into the proactive activities around actually leveraging some of the AI capabilities to surface potential suspicion of non-confirmed yet false negative and false positive cases in order to make changes to the algorithm they have in place. Now, with AI, and by AI specifically, I mean large language models and not machine learning, the time they have to spend on figuring out a quick overview, let's say, of the customer history or also generating reports in terms of pulling all the data in and surfacing the most important insights have majorly advanced, which means that in 3-4 years, you had to look at, let's say, 1,000 signals coming from the customer behavior, also related to the digital footprint on device. And you had to figure out all the time, like, hey, which are always the most important data points I look at and basically draw a conclusion based on that, whether this could be like truly a false negative or false positive. Now with AI, it's very easy to generate a summary of that and then tell you like, hey, here's like, 3 sentences of based on the historical most important signals that you should consider in order to make that assessment. The way how that insight was surfaced was truly empowered with the help of LLMs. And also when customers had to turn that into a certain report for their internal efforts or also in order to let's say when we talk about, an AML case to create a suspicious activity report, which needs to be filed based on a template with the regulatory bodies, or in case it ends up being a dispute and you have to generate a template-based, evidence-based report, like LLMs can pull all the data in if they are pointed to the right places, and it doesn't require a human to type up the whole wall of text in order to provide that to the related third-party bodies. Now that's actually quite easy. What has changed also is that essentially, when you look at a ton of data and you are in the shoes of a fraud analyst, historically you had to have SQL experience in order to create your own queries, to slice and dice the data you need to see through. Now with LLMs, if you feed your table column names and also like the type of the data fields, it can recommend you the best SQL without having the knowledge of actually writing the SQL yourself.
No.
If I zoom out a little bit, there are some larger organizations, enterprise grade companies who are capable of investing and building internal tools, dashboards, data warehouses for their own investigation, which might be pulling in data from third-party places. Sometimes they, still relied on the vendor's algorithm in the end. Sometimes they build their own algorithm. But given the advantage of these vibe coding tools, actually, the way how they could orchestrate those data signals into one interface, and also as well as building potentially a user interface for managing the rules if they have this in-house need. With the vibe coding tools, it's actually much more easy and it requires less dev resource. Fraud and risk teams have been facing constant pushback from engineering, given the roadmap bottlenecks. It was always a theme. Now, actually, there are all these no-code environments and vibe coding tools which can help you to build more effective in-house tools as well. But still, the challenging part is that if you don't have the right data to work with, it's just not enough to have your own internal data warehouse data. You have to spend a lot of time researching what actually additional insights you need to add to the mix in order to come up with the best conclusion. And then it takes just still a really long time to orchestrate those data sources, build that internal tool up. So what I found really interesting is that many vendors have just leveraged these capabilities to speed up their own development speed, but also how I look at in terms of what the vendors have achieved in this space is that surfacing insights earlier throughout the manual review process in order to help the end users, the fraud analysts, to become more effective, more productive in their daily operation. And this could be capabilities around turning human language input into creating rules or filters. I mentioned like great example, writing SQL queries might be not so hard and unique skill if you can just guide your LLM to write your query, whether if it's your external internal tool, and as well as how the daily operation is performed for them to carry out those specific changes in the algorithm. Could have been, it is actually greatly increased in terms of the velocity of the operation, given they have quicker access to certain insights and they can draw conclusions faster based on certain patterns they do recognize. But honestly, there is still a huge limitations of LLMs in terms of not being able to handle the large context of, let's say, 6 months worth of data. You cannot just send a prompt to an LLM and say like, hey, here's all the data I have from the entire account of 6 months. This could be millions, if not hundreds of millions of transactions. Your LLM would break. It's too big of a context window for them to handle. So it's more like taking that data and providing those insights and surface them at the right point in time in order for a human to be able to draw quicker conclusions, and rather than spending too much time on the repetitive actions, manual work, clicking around on the same buttons and interface. Automation didn't really require LLMs, but also LLMs became incredibly helpful in order to just provide you the right data at the right time and guide the humans towards the right decisions by keeping them in the loop and making them still a supervisor of the entire algorithm in a more efficient manner, I would say. And this is just still the beginning, right? If you look at the whole SaaS space, many of the incumbent vendors, I mean, almost most of them have leveraged LLM to the same extent. It didn't replace the entire solution, but it did help them to elevate the work of the end user in order to do more with less resources, right? So when I'm speaking with, customers of our own solution and, industry experts, what I'm hearing is constantly, hey, I'm expanding to new markets. Fraud as an issue is growing. Even AI has helped fraudsters to scale up their own operation with agentic workflows, with, image generation capabilities, etc., etc. So they're facing just higher and more risk-related concerns. So even if the traffic goes up, but if the fraud rates stay static, that means just more transactions to review, more people to have on board to actually mitigate those risks. So what they're telling me is like, hey, I have entered this new market. I have to hire new people. It's super hard to find people with the experience of fraud detection. It's not something they teach in any school or universities. You have to learn it by doing it. And then they're struggling to build up the team. So they are increasingly looking into ways of automating their internal workflows, looking at tools who can provide them more support on that front. But in the end, if we extray what these teams are spending time on is, more on the proactive side, as I've mentioned, of actually being on the forefront of making changes to their algorithm and not so much of just like dealing with the already existing happened events, which are on the reactive side. And that's how machine learning works. So you need to have this experience of knowing what to look for in order to be proactive and fully manage your traffic related incoming flow and risk related to that too. So overall, like a lot of opportunities, a lot of new threat vectors have been opened up thanks to AI. But according to a recent survey, like the budgets are increasing. So these companies are actually like capable of hiring more people or adopting new tools, just given that the ROI will be about closing the data of the fraud losses plus the internal investments in people and tools and everything else. If this data can be shrinking, that's the budget they get in order to do that.
Yeah. And so if we were to flip it the other way, and so there's been a lot of changes, a lot of development with AI and automation, what would you say that was one thing that everyone thought AI would be able to do?
Yeah.
But in reality, it hasn't.
Yeah, to replace humans, right? Like, there is a promise out there from many vendors, not just in the fraud space, but also, broad in the SaaS vector that, hey, we are going to give you agentic workflows. You can actually stop hiring people. You can even shrink your team size because we'll give you all the tools, all the processes, and the best possible algorithm. Well, in reality, that hasn't really happened, right? Like the point is that you still need humans, but you need probably smarter humans. You don't need those humans who are, with no experience, with no skills in the space. You are better off by having a smaller but smarter team than having like a large team and just doing like a bunch of manual processes. Some of our clients have teams of hundreds and dealing with a number of transactions. Some teams who we work with are much smaller, but dealing with way higher volumes. And just because they have been able to automate more processes on their side, and they also don't really like trust the vendors in terms of what they're promising in terms of having all these automation possibilities. In reality, a lot of it can be done also internally and also from the vendor side. But this promise is very exciting for some buyers, but maybe I would say like it's more a message towards to the boards and more towards to the higher level ops in an org who are actually not on the front line and they not dealing on a daily basis with all these, fraud analyst related activities. So when you talk to like, those people, they of course would buy into like, saving costs and working with just a vendor who does everything for them. But in reality, when you talk to the mid-level management and when you talk to the ICs, they're always doubtful and they're always suspicious about like, okay, how this will really help me? Will it replace my job? In reality, it won't, but it could help to elevate the job they are doing. So if I look into the future, this might be actually true in terms of, hey, some companies will achieve a higher level of operational excellency and they might not have to hire more people even if their traffic goes up, right? But I don't think we are 100% there yet. It will take a couple of years for those teams to actually leverage to the maximum extent possible the capabilities of agentic workflows, and not just offered by fraud vendors, because honestly, those are like, as of today, quite underwhelming. You can actually do even better if you have a really small, smart team who is capable of building their own agentic workflows and working with the vendor's data, and maybe extracting features and tailoring to their own risk appetite those vectors by building an algorithm with in-house tools, other than like fully trusting a plug and play of the chef vendor claiming they can do everything without the human in the loop, right? There's a lot of AI washing going on in the space, which means that they just put AI on their marketing materials. They call APIs AI, they call automation AI, they call everything that is related to like automation possibilities as agentic workflows. In reality, an agentic workflow would mean that you're capable of drawing conclusions on the data, but then no one is really trusting the system to make decisions on its own. So you see that a human still need to be in the loop at certain points, even as an agentic workflow carries out its activity, because you want to be sure that the changes we are making to the algorithm are actually fully aligned with our policies, with our risk appetite. There will be a human in the process, even a couple of years out. But what the humans will do differently is like the possibility of elevating their own capabilities means that they will be able to like design these agentic workflows. They will be able to implement the guardrails and constantly configure the outcomes of these agentic workflow processes, and then still stay in the loop and then oversee all those recommendations. But this is like, now more like in a semi-autonomous manner. Eventually, it can be like fully autonomous, but in a way where, you look at self-driving cars. Today, you still have to sit behind the wheel and look at the windshield. We are not even there yet with fraud detection, right? Like you still have to like take a hold of the wheels in a lot of cases, like in most of the time. But over time, like it's possible that even a one-person fraud team could handle like millions of volumes and make those changes in the right way. But there will be definitely like help from outside of the fraud department, from product engineering and CS, in order to empower that person to handle everything on their own. But this is quite far out in the future.
What's a responsible way to kind of set expectations when selling kind of cutting edge tools for fighting fraud, implementing AI?
Yeah, I would say like, if I would be in the buyer's shoes, obviously what I'm being reporting on, these metrics, F1, precision recall, and anything that wasn't confusion metrics. Now the question is like, hey, if I'm taking a new tool in place which helps me in order to make better decisions, that helps to improve on these metrics, or increasing the level of those metrics by having an algorithm in place, like eventually the goal will be to have the most accurate algorithm in place. Now in many cases, where I see AI has been successful is not just telling you like, hey, these are the changes you should make in your algorithm, but really drawing the conclusion to that point. And I think many times vendors are very they're claiming things that are related to like actually having the most and most best possible algorithm from day one in place, and we are going to just give you this maybe unsupervised model that gives you the best possible decision making capability. And in reality, like every business is different, every industry is different, the fraud they are facing is different, and it's changing so much. So I wouldn't really trust that claim from the vendors of, hey, when you plug in our tool, you just send us the data you have, and we will give you the best possible decision. That's not going to happen in reality. So you need to have those, solid understanding of, okay, what data is this vendor is extending my own data, right? And what can I do in the system in order to leverage those data signals, data points, attributes, and features to tailor to the algorithm to the best outcomes. If you don't have a possibility to sync up your own policies with the AI models that are being out of the box recommended, then you will have subpar results, right? You need to know like, hey, if I'm not selling in certain markets, an AI system shouldn't allow me to accept transactions in that place. historically, there were vendors who were super machine learning focused. And the problem with those vendors were that you couldn't really tuck in your policies into that decision-making algorithms. Sometimes they were, opaque or black box, but you couldn't really combine to say like, hey, I know about these, 80 rules, 80 policies I just have to have in place, and how I can mix that into the algorithm. And most of those vendors actually weren't capable of doing that. They said like, hey, just take my decision. It's going to be like the best decision you can have. And we don't care of your policies because we are sure that, our decision will be better. Well, in reality, if people have built those policies and rules up internally, and are aware of the historical risks the business saw, and in alignment of like the compliance team, or the historical learnings from interactions with CS, or with the card issuers, or with payment gateways. Yeah, you have to have that in place. Your human needs to build that, or at least to a large extent need to control that, and then you have to mix that in to the AI-driven algorithm. But still, the AI-driven algorithm needs to adhere your existing policies and rules, which are business critical and tailored to risk appetite. It needs to enhance it. It doesn't have to overwrite it completely. And I think there is this data of, hey, you can go to a vendor and do an offline POC, and you can send certain data points over. They might come up with something that's like the best possible rule set, but it's only based on like maybe the last 3 months, or maybe just like a simple set of a specific month or specific couple of weeks, or again like a randomized set of transactions. Doesn't mean like they would know everything about your business, about your historical fraud events, about what happened a year ago, which you had to build a custom rule for, which then you are still applying because you know that it can happen anytime. It's just not enough, right? So what we usually do, and this I think is the best approach, is start with building a solution which is enhanced with AI, basically based on the custom rules that you have as per your policies, and then start with that, and have more like a less risk averse appetite. And then as you see certain patterns emerging, as time goes on, and you have certain clues and hints and insights that navigates you to even the help of AI, make sure that those are implemented in the real-time assessment based algorithm. That's, I think, the best way. Like if you go in and like have a very risk aware algorithm in place, and sometimes it's offered by the AI, you will have too many false positives, right? Like you will actually lose more money on blocking good customers and good transactions, because these patterns are changing on a daily basis. If you close one loophole and one exploit, fraudsters will quickly find another one. So the question is like, what you can do on the proactive side to make sure you close those loopholes, because the domino effect kicks in and it's too late. That's why machine learning on its own is not as effective. And even AI, as machine learning being a subset of AI, is not effective because it's based on confirmed labels. While the confirmed labels, if they come from the card issuers because of existing chargebacks or tickets from CS, that's the reactive part. Like if you want to be proactive, you should be screening real time all of your transactions and finding connected accounts. You have to make sure that based on those insights, you actually, even without waiting for a confirmation from the card issuer that, hey, it was a stolen card, or hey, this was a fake account, from CS for whatever reason, you have to be sure that you have a team who's capable of drawing those conclusions as early as possible on, and then making those changes in the algorithm, and having a system which can make those changes, whether it's internal or external. The problem is like, teams who were capable in the past to building up those systems, engineering people, they had no experience. They had to be told and provided a very specific ADR, very specific scope, like, hey, this is what I want to do, but it is constantly evolving. So at least with vibe coding tools, you can expand on that. But even vibe coding tools, especially if they're used for external use cases, they have a lot of risks, right? Like, you don't know if it can break any time. Then at some point you will have to pull in really engineering to review the entire code base you have built up. Maybe it's, sloppy, and then they have to spend way more time rewriting the whole thing. So some teams are actually like capable of having engineers vibe coded tools in place, and they can progress fast. But again, that requires roadmap, bandwidth allocation, and in the end, like if the vendor claims that, hey, I can do everything for you, and the board believes that, then you might end up taking on a tool which actually doesn't help you as much as some others, or maybe the combination of some tools plus some internal, it's so dynamic. It's changing every week, with the possibilities of OpenClaw and, what cloud can offer now today with their co-working solution. It's very exciting, but, we haven't seen like, a huge enterprise deploying this solution, specifically like OpenClaw. Of course, internet use cloud for the engineering team or with the product team. And of course, like anyone can use it in most organizations because no one wants to be left behind. In that, like, are these solutions producing enterprise grade tools? Not in all cases, right? Not in all cases, unfortunately. Maybe in a couple of years, yes. And the same goes for the vendors, right? Like if they are claiming that this algorithm will just, without proper training on your data, without understanding your business, will produce best results. That's, as overpromise that we see. And that's when, some merchants and operators are ready to try out 3 different tools at the same time and see which one after 3 months will produce the best ROI. So I highly advocate of, running parallel tests, live tests, not just offline batch tests, but integrate 3 tools. It's going to be super big of an overhead for your team, but then that's how you can really find the nitty-gritty details of, okay, which tool is the most capable of solving your own fraud problems. Because in the space, everyone claims that they're capable of doing everything. They can solve all your problems across all the different verticals, across all the use cases. In reality, it's never true, right? Like you will end up finding out that, hey, for this specific fraud type, which might be the new issue that you have to tackle, this vendor is not capable of solving. Their algorithm is not supporting the data powering their algorithm, is not supporting the key decision making. So they will look into a new tool and then end up, having 6 tools in place at the end, and maybe some internal solutions as well. So that's why I highly, highly advocate for like, hey, having, parallel run live tests, POCs, POVs with multiple vendors to find out, okay, which one really is the best solution. It's not based on who, yells the loudest about AI capabilities. It's really like, hey, based on my own fraud events, my attack types, my business type, is this solution really have the right data and the right algorithm and right interface to empower my team in order to make those decisions, to make changes in the algorithm in the fastest way possible to improve on those main metrics, F1 precision, recall, etc. And are they able to help me to report on those to the higher ups, or will I have to export everything every week to generate my own reports with another LM tool, to justify the need of that specific tool? Now, often, boards might not even care of the tools. They care about okay, are we still losing money? Are we losing more money compared to the overall traffic that's going through the system? Yes or no? If we're losing more money, they will push the team to spend more and try out more things. And if it's actually getting better and better, which is the goal of every of these teams, then, they can see, okay, how I can actually become even more and more proactive and continuously, improve on those metrics.
If you were to promise full automation and you delivered maybe 70 to 80%, is that still failure? 70-80% automation is quite impressive, right? But it's not the full automation that you promised. So would you say that was failure with these tools?
No, the hard part is to get from, 50, but to get to 50% automation is usually not that hard as to get from 50 to 70 and from 70 to 90. It gets, as you try to automate, towards a higher and higher percentage, it gets extremely harder and harder. To get from 90 to 95 is way harder to get from, 25 to 70, let's say as an example. And then you look at, okay, how many headcount I have in the team, what they're doing on a daily basis. You can shadow them, you can extract the operation, what buttons they click on, what decision-making process they have. And you can see okay, well, if I can take a workflow automation tool to actually cut 30%, I give you a clear example. We have our own professional services team who generates, let's say, weekly reports for our clients in terms of the main outcomes of the algorithm. This is part of the UI as well, but a lot of our clients have specific needs in terms of their own data. So you cannot have a UI which covers everything for every client. We have to generate those reports automatically, and the client should be able to do that on their own. But honestly, that was a year ago, 30% of this team's time. And now with AI, it takes a click of a button to generate that report. They used to click around the UI, export data, look into their own internal data warehouse, use Tableau or use some other tools to have on the BI front to visualize or even explain based on a table, the main metrics and if there's, any issues related to the incoming traffic based on, the last time when they generated the last report, like what's happened the last 1 week or so. Because with a click of a button, it's possible. It just saves so much time. So they can actually like go in and spend more time in the customer's account to proactively help them to surface insights and intel, which they might not have the bandwidth for, right? And this is what also our best clients are able to achieve is like, hey, I don't have to export data from SEON every week because, I can just use SEON's MCPs to like generate that report upfront for me. They don't even have to use API. So it can be all possibly a no-code environment. And it's just one step of the flow. It's like, very, very high up in the chain. But if you look into like, hey, I spend as an analyst most of my day reviewing accounts and finding connected accounts and then coming up with some recommendations to make those changes. Like the way how you can speed the operation up is really to have them to, empower this work in order to get to these conclusions, which is backed up by existing data from the system. And then they just have to give a thumbs up, thumbs down, or look at the edge cases truly without having like a noisy list of all the transactions and then spending most of the time really finding those edge cases and work on that. Now we can surface the edge cases instead of the noise, and then they can spend most of the time on the edge cases rather than cutting through the noise and finding those edge cases instead.
We mentioned talent. We've dipped into it through the conversation so far. Why do you think good fraud practitioners are so rare?
Yeah. So if I think about like what makes someone a good and an expert in fraud fighting, it's truly about, do they have experience of doing the job? Like if just someone is starting from day one, they might not know like, what signals to look at what point, what data has to be considered in a priority order. And as I mentioned, like, finding those edge cases is really the skill of the most experienced analysts and fraud folks. So what makes them so good is because they have experience and also they understand the business in most cases. So if they were maybe on the CS side or maybe on the product side building some internal tools and looking through data in the past, having access to, the cases that have occurred in the past, or maybe from another job, knowing like, hey, I work for a similar company, they can slice and dice the data in a way which would surface those edge cases better. And then they can look at, okay, what data I have available? Do I have to like gather more data? Is the system that's used for detailed decision making where I store the algorithm, either a rule set or the machine learning model? Like, can I make changes based on those conclusions quickly? If they can really, and the historical fraud pattern, business risk appetite needs, and the events that happen with the business, and then guide the rest of the organization towards to having a place, either internally built or from a vendor, where they can like implement those policies, rules, and changes in combination with a model offered, built by data science teams internally or offered by the vendor. Can I combine the two really and then improve on the metrics, right? So if I take a step back, if I look at the worst teams in this space, like, they don't even like report on these metrics, so they have a hard time to voice what they are doing on a daily basis, and they have a hard time to gather the data they need in order to justify, hey, why are we asking for more headcount? What's going on with the increased fraud losses? Why it's happening? Well, if you can cover that upfront and you can be actually hold accountable, you have to be trusted, right? Like you have to be trusted by making sure that the other business stakeholders are able to perceive that what you are being measured on, what are these metrics, how they are built up. And if you can do that, then actually there will be less oversight from higher ups by trying to hold you accountable to those metrics. They understand like, hey, I have the metrics. Even if, something is not going well, they have to be vulnerable. They have to be vocal about it. Like, yes, something happened. We didn't have the right, process in place, or, this vendor has failed because they don't have this algorithmic capability or they lack data, and they can actually like tell, hey, the reason why, this metric is not improving is because X, Y, Z, but this is what I'm doing about it. Like looking, at a new vendor or, increasing the efficiency of one of the processes we are running, or they are able to like say, hey, we just need this data from another system, which happens to have no connectivity with our own tool or with the algorithm we are setting up. And then building those bridges is super important as well. So the best teams are capable of articulating, the metrics, the work they are doing. They're vulnerable to anything that is changing, and they can build a team who is capable of, having the workflows organized in a way which produce the best possible results. But they're also aware of, the tools, pros and cons they're using. They're able to become champions internally to have supportive functions from other parts of the organization to have them to build those bridges with the connections, or have them to improve on visibility on certain aspects of the business. In the end, it's today very fragmented. So they might be using 5-6 different tools. They might have 6 tabs open for one investigation. If they could have just one tab open, and that's why enterprises are actually building their own tools, and they just need the best in class data sources, is because they don't want to spend too much time shifting between these tabs and having a system for AML, one for KYC, one for transaction monitoring, one for device fingerprinting. You have to bring all those signals into one specific customer profile. And those big organizations were capable, just given how much resources they had from engineering a product, to build those internal tools in a way where they could have this centralized view of one user account and all their transactions, and find connected accounts utilizing those best in class data signals and tools. Right now, when we talk about high growth businesses, they just go from 0 to 100 million customers in a couple of years. They don't have the time and the bandwidth to build all those up from scratch. It's different from one of the tier 1 banks versus one of the fastest growing digital marketplaces, right? They try to move differently in terms of those, high growth businesses might look for more end-to-end tools offered by the vendors out of the box, rather than spending 2-3 years building something up from scratch and hiring tens, if not hundreds of engineers and product people to build those internal tools. They don't have the time. When they would be ready with that, they would be losing already too much, and the whole project might be shut down. Those companies who are capable of combining this, hey, we are going to take the best in class vendors, but still we can draw a fine line of what's being external, what's being internal, and how we can support the growth of the business, keeping fraud levels low, and articulating that the business is key. And again, from a buyer perspective, some of the vendors are claiming, hey, they will be useful for a tier 1 bank, but also for an e-commerce business. That's not true. An e-commerce business, if they're small, they might not even have a full-time employee focusing on fraud and risk. They want to have something off the shelf. But of course, those vendors maybe are not completely tailored to risk appetite. And maybe they will have too many false positives. Now, for a bank, they want to have the least amount of false positives. That's why they had all these resources and thousands of people focused in on building those internal tools and constantly evolving. Now, the high growth small businesses might not have the time and resources. So there's a fine balance. That's why you have to be also very wary and very knowledgeable about, okay, if I have this issue, I have this risk, I have these resources, which vendor should I go with based on how quickly we can go live with them, how big is really the issue, what my product team is demanding for the best customer experience, how we can have the least frictionful user experience for our customers, even balancing, security and the risk aspects of it. And yeah, it's just different for every different type of business, depending on their scale and the risk vectors they're experiencing.
Yeah, and what about on the vendor side? So when you've been building SEON, what surprised you in the gaps in practitioner knowledge?
I mean, honestly, I grew up in this space, right? So right after university, we started SEON, and we've been talking with thousands of practitioners in this space. I think what's surprising is most people end up in this job. Basically, you end up, doing fraud because no one else wants to do it in an organization, or because you're interested, but you never heard of it, and you grow up in this space also. Right? So I see a lack of people who have 15 years of experience, not even 10, 5, also very limited, but 2 years experience, that's normal. I do see more people with 2-3 years of experience versus 5, or even less so for 10s. Most of these people, even if they started, we've met people when we started, they're still maybe doing this job, right? And those people are kind of the most experienced, they have the longest tenure doing this job. and they're able to easily like solve for the business challenges if they are given the right resources, if they know which vendors to pick. And I was thinking like, hey, when we started in this space, I thought that there will be like tens of thousands of people with 10 years of experience. That wasn't the case. Like we only met like people with 1 or 2 years of experience, and that was only like a small pool. Now we have, of course, more people because the industry has grown so much. But, when I go to some of these conferences, most of the people who I met just started this, role maximum like 2 years, right? Like they are brand new, they are learning, and there's a lack of education offered by, organizations, from vendors. So really everyone is like trying to get as much information based on their own experience and from vendors, but there's not such a place where they can go and just learn, like without any kind of like underlying sales interest from vendors, right? I feel like most industry practitioners are so eager just to learn more, but there's not the right place for them to learn. Like there's not a specific certification or training program they can attend to become an experts of the field, right? They have to like get the job, really learn everything, and when they go to another place, if they change verticals, if it's another industry, then maybe there's like a small overlap, so they have to relearn again so many things. So there are certain verticals, let's say like digital banking or iGaming or BNPL or e-commerce, where people might shift between these verticals, but the overlap of the usefulness of their existing knowledge might be limited. Sometimes it's actually quite big, sometimes it's very limited, but there's no like 100% overlap between any industries, right? So when you go and look for a new job, then you might have to learn a lot of things, because maybe like, the main risk issue is related to like fake accounts and not chargebacks, right? Maybe chargebacks are only related to friendly fraud, and at the previous place, you never had to deal with friendly fraud because it wasn't an issue. Or maybe, you were only dealing with, third-party fraud and, fake accounts. I never heard about friendly fraud. So you have to like relearn everything about what really friendly fraud or first-party fraud would mean and how effectively you can fight that. Some people were spending all their career in this space, just like writing up, template-based disputes for, fighting the chargebacks, and weren't really like taking care of, proactively preventing fraud by having an algorithm in place. Or maybe they were using an off-the-shelf vendor who was specifically focused on, payment-related chargebacks, and all they had to do is like push in the right data to the system from like CS and card issuers and connect the dots. But they go to a new place, they don't have that system in place, and then they have to find out, okay, well, what else is out there, right? Like what other vendors are claiming, being the best at, and was this actually like the right approach at my previous role to use a fully outsourced off-the-shelf vendor, or can I maybe have 2-3 people, who are smart enough to build something up or use a vendor who is capable of offering configuration capabilities, which would be fully aligned with my new roles, my new business where I'm at, risk appetite. And can I place that knowledge into an algorithm, a framework, which can be tailored continuously based on what we are seeing, and not rely on an overpriced vendor who just have the same people on their side and offering this service for a higher margin, because it's always cheaper to build things and do things internally. Historically, like that wasn't really the case in e-commerce. Like if you look at digital banks, BNPL companies, they were taking best-in-class vendors. They were never working with just those payment and chargeback-focused vendors. The people who had experience from actually building the algorithm on their own, they have built a more versatile skill just than connecting the dots and feeding that data into an external vendor who handles all that stuff. And those people are capable of actually like becoming, the advocates of why it matters for us to like, hire more people, and how we can really train them, and how we can be, accountable for the higher ups in the business, rather than just having a vendor to do all of that kind of stuff.
Well, your passion is so strong about the space. It's been fascinating talking to you, and thank you for sharing some of your insights. We can't let you go without kind of maybe predicting what a fraud practitioner or even the fraud space might look like. I wouldn't go as far as 5 years, maybe in the next 2 years. But what do you see happening?
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of consideration, not from just the buyer perspective. I think there will be from the buyer perspective a lot of consideration, because it is becoming incredibly harder and harder to manage 6 vendors and keep up with the changes of the customer journey, building data warehouses, and getting the resources internally. So I think a lot of the buyers, in terms of the merchants and operators, will actually look for vendors who can offer maybe 2 solutions through one API, or maybe 3 or 4, rather than having like 6 different solutions in place. If they can be convinced that they're still offering best-in-class services across all those different products and solutions. Well, from the vendor perspective, we do see that there are some really large companies out there who hasn't really been growing. So I think they might be doing some roll-ups and merges with other companies who are like strong in other verticals. But I think there's like a increased pressure, coming out from the COVID era. During COVID, all these vendors have raised like huge amounts of VC fundings, and they haven't really got back to the same valuation level. So they were not be able to raise funding at the same valuation. So they are struggling now to keep up with, innovation. They might be looking for buyers, but they're really overpriced based on last valuation. So I think there will be some merges, some roll-ups happening very soon, the next 2 years, which will actually, I think, be quite healthy for the whole industry, given that, some of these vendors are trying to play games with, increased pricing and, not really like providing better service or products. Just, they want to they're super focused in on like keeping their own customers, and like they're super happy even if they get like quarterly one new customer who are like gigantic. In the end, they will be fighting for the Walmarts of the world, for the Bank of Americas in the world, right? And not many of them will actually be able to succeed, by continuous innovation.
It's something we'll keep an eye on. I think it, like you say, is healthy to see a bit of consolidation in the space. And for yourself, for SEON, where can people catch you? What have you got coming up this year?
Yeah, we are in a high growth journey. We are a multi-product solution. So we have started out as, a core fraud service provider, but we knew that 80% of our clients are using solutions for compliance, for KYC. We have made some big bets in order to actually build up a solution that does way more as a system of record than anyone else out there. So we are laser focused right now on fulfilling this, vision of making the internet a safer place to do business and becoming a category leader. We have only fulfilled a small part of this vision. So right now, everything we do is helping us to take steps forward to get there. In Europe, that's where we have started from. We have already like a good brand, and people do see us and know about us. But in US, that's where most of our competitors are. That's where really the big market is. So we are trying to make more and more strides in the US. And meanwhile, we are a global business. We have clients from all over the world, from more than 100 countries. We are trying to be the go-to solution for any online business out there in the entire globe for detection, risk, and compliance.
Amazing. Well, looking forward to keeping up with that and seeing how you get on and cracking the US. Tamas, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure as well, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Awesome. And to listeners, until next time. Ciao, ciao.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Want to hear more about fighting fraud with tech? Subscribe to Leading Detection wherever you get your podcasts.